Scott Pilgrim vs. the World is a movie based on the comics by Brian Lee O'Malley. Scott Pilgrim, shocker, is about a 22-year-old who tries to get what he thinks is a baddie, Ramona Flowers. But Scott has to go through his own challenge. He has to defeat Ramona's 7 deadly exes to get to her. You can't forget the main part of Scott. He is a gamer, dedicated to the art. This movie really leans into the parts relating to video games, as you can see throughout the movie with various Easter eggs and whatnot. Speaking of video games, there is a Scott Pilgrim video game released in 2010. The story of Scott Pilgrim starts off with Scott trying to do what all Minecraft YouTubers like to do from time to time: pick up their high school girlfriend. He goes with his roommate, Wallace, who was against the idea of him dating her. Scott tries to defend himself from these questionable actions by using every logical fallacy I learned in English class, and Wallace just goes along with it, not really caring. Wallace really does have that it's your own thing mentality towards Scott. I guess it works for him, but whatever makes him get through the problem. Scott then gets to his apartment after meeting his high school girlfriend, Knives Chow, who is 17. She seems to be his gamer girl to his gamer guy. But, looking past all the legal aspects of it, it's definitely something as they go shopping and all the other stuff. They go to the comic shop and they have a lot of fun as they go on a, let's call it, quote-unquote, date. Later we get to see Scott go through the process of getting into a party, a real party with beer, alcohol, and all that other stuff that happens in Toronto, Canada. Just something that won't end up Scott in prison. Probably. Then we get to see the Scott Pilgrim party action. Nothing wild, just the type of guy to think, they don't know I'm the gamer here, in the corner as he stands with a solo cup, a red solo cup. He's standing at the party with Wallace, but then Wallace gets a little, let's just say, busy. So he ditches Scott to go primal or whatever. Scott then looks around the room and sees Ramona Flowers, the dyed hair barista everyone online seems to need in their life. It's everywhere. The style is just everywhere online, I guess, but I digress. Scott goes up to Ramona and talks to her, in Scott Pilgrim fashion, awkwardly yet in the Michael Cera way. Scott then realizes that she works for multi-trillion-dollar company Amazon, so he orders a package in hopes of getting it delivered by her. Luckily, this does happen, in a lack of Amazon drivers in Toronto, I guess, and he sees her. This is where he asks her to go on a date, and she says, sure, for whatever reason, I guess, because I guess the times are different. They go on a date at Hillcrest Park, and they have a fun time, very fun. They have a real talk on the swings before the season of winter hits in Toronto. This was the worst thing or best thing to happen to Scott, depending on how you look at how he and Ramona are at the moment. But they head back to Ramona's apartment. While at Ramona's apartment, Scott accidentally walks in on Ramona changing and apologizes while scurrying away. Ramona says it's okay and then allows Scott to sleep in her bed since the blizzard outside is getting bad. While they sleep together, Scott invites Ramona to the Battle of the Bands. She says yes, even though it sounds like a battle royale for bands, and she does not know what she's getting herself into. They go to the Battle of the Bands, which is at the Club Rocket, where Ramona meets Stacy, Wallace, and Jimmy. She watches Scott Pilgrim and his band Sex Bomb perform while Jimmy cheats on Stacy for Wallace. Midway through the performance, however, Sex Bomb gets interrupted by Matthew Patel, the first evil ex of Ramona. This is where Scott and Matthew have their epic battle. Using the power of music, after being told that Matthew and Ramona dated in the past, Scott defeats the first evil ex. Afterwards, Scott and Ramona start dating, and she tells him about the 7 deadly exes, like the 7 deadly sins, do you get it? Afterwards, we learn the next evil ex is Lucas Lee, a name I feel like I've heard before in real life, as Scott prepares for the battle. He rents a movie from the store that Lee is in. Since he is an actor, breaks up with Knives because he can, then watches the movie with Ramona. After this, Scott and Lee have their, as Scott Pilgrim Wiki defines it, the skirmish at Casa Loma. This is where they have a fighting game type of style with their fight, and it feels like you're watching a Street Fighter game or something. Hard to describe, but you'll see it if you actually watch it. Anyways, Scott wins the fight and gets more money because whenever somebody gets defeated, money always drops from them, as we know. Other than Scott committing the heinous Chicago crime of killing for money, Ramona and Knives have a little skirmish of their own. A short battle as Knives tries to get back at Ramona for all the dilly-dallying she and Scott have done, as well as Scott dating her. It's a whatever moment as Ramona introduces Scott to her next evil ex, Todd Ingram. Scott tries to fight Todd, but fails due to Todd's vegan powers, so don't mess with him. Every time I meet a vegan, they always have the same powers as Todd, so, watch out and, don't mess with them, because they might actually slam you through a wall, like Scott did here. Sadly, but happily, maybe, this forces Scott to crash at Ramona's place. Afterwards, they tell each other about their own history and relationships, and whatnot. Whatever. Makes sense on both sides. This is before vegan Todd breaks his oh-so-careful diet, before the next epic battle with Scott. The Battle of the Bases, which sounds like an internet thing, which is what happens next as well. Scott is able to defeat Todd because his vegan powers that everyone has are taken away because he broke his diet. You can't do that. And he is nothing but a mere mortal now, because vegans are on a different plane of existence. After this, the fourth evil ex we see is Roxy Richter, a girl, which is the first for the evil ex kind. Ramona was a lesbian in a lesbian relationship with her because she said she wanted to see or something like that. I forgot the reasoning. It's whatever. Anyways, the first encounter we see with her is when she half battles Scott, and I'm really seriously not r/serious. Then we witness Scott get the ultimate power that Redditors are always chasing, the power of love, as he confesses to Ramona and earns it. A big move for the newly earned Scott. After this, we get to see Roxy again, but this time Scott doesn't fight her. This time, it's for Ramona to defend Scott. Reasons forgotten, but she defends him only against Roxy. Using an ultimate hammer like the Pokemon Tickaton, Ramona defeats Roxy, and therefore gets money and all the other stuff that happens when you murder. Not murder. I mean defeat somebody. So now Scott is halfway through the 7 evil exes, and so he can have Ramona to himself and be rich with all this money he's getting. Anyways, next up, Sex Bomb signs up for the Toronto International Battle of the Bands, the ultimate chance to prove themselves to get that really cool and radical label signature, what everybody on TikTok wants. Even though there were 6 big labels controlling every other label, that's a discussion for another day. But I digress again. This is their time to shine into hashtag rock and roll now. Once they get to the battle, Scott realizes his next enemy in defeating the League of Ramona's evil exes. They also seem to have captured Kim Pine from Sex Bomb. This time it'll be more difficult since it's a pair of twins, which is kind of weird on Ramona's part more than anything else. Whatever. It's a whole story that would need explaining for it to make sense. I don't have that explanation, so don't ask. The twins are also performing at the battle, which is where they have a music battle. The 2 spirits of music in it of themselves, a yeti and a dragon. The 2 animals we all think about when we think of music. This battle rules on with the songs played by Sex Bomb, and they eventually are able to defeat the twins and save Kim from them. This earns Scott an extra life in his points. Remember that. After this, Scott tells Ramona that he's in lesbians with her, which is a case, but not the biggest fumble in a movie. It could be worse. Ramona then surprisingly says they need to break up, only to go back with Gideon. Gideon is the evil person who Ramona is now dating, which is weird because we knew nothing about him from earlier. Maybe, I don't know. Maybe in the comics. After this, we see that Sex Bomb followed up on their deal to play at that crazy theater with a little twist when we actually see them when Scott visits. He gets to the Caesar to talk with Gideon and sees that he's captured Sex Bomb and now under his control in the state, and Scott has to save them by defeating Gideon. Since this is also the final boss, it's going to be difficult to defeat him because they're under his Neuralink status. Before Scott can actually fight Gideon, he has to fight his goons, his hipsters as the wiki would call them. He defeats the hipsters using the recently acquired power of Love Sword that he's gotten by telling Ramona he is fighting for her. This is also when Knives from before fights Ramona for Scott, and they have their own side battle where Scott has his, which is more important. While Scott defeats the hipsters and tells Ramona and Knives he cheated on both of them, technically, admitting it was his fault and neither of theirs. Sadly, before he can make his rights, Scott gets stabbed in the back of the back. What a tragedy in Toronto. This is when he wakes up in the desert with Ramona. This is where she tells him that she's been brainwashed by Gideon with a little chip in her body. And, yep, now we figure out Neuralink and how it was implemented. Scott now makes his amends with his friends as he makes his redemption era, or whatever modern term you can spin this into. But honestly, it's a very good scene because Scott actually makes sure everybody knows how he feels truly. He also says he is fighting Gideon for himself, which earns him the true stoic power everybody's after on Reddit. He gets a sword of self-respect along with the power. After this, Scott takes his extra life and fights Gideon with it. This is, of course, after defeating hipsters with it again. He comes back to Gideon and fights him Ninja Gaiden style and defeats him by stabbing him with the sword. This is when Knives goes to fight Ramona and Scott breaks up the fight. Luckily, this time he can actually apologize to them and have good faith. After this, Scott and the dying Gideon have one last talk with each other before Scott kicks Gideon in the face and gets $7 billion. Yes, $7 billion. Scott's now a 1%er in all of the world, and we'll just ignore that because of taxes. After Scott gets his riches, he has to face the dark side of Scott. I'm not going to attempt to say the name, but just know it's Scott but evil. This is a false story, actually, because Evil Scott and Scott become friends. Evil Scott is a nice guy, but not like Reddit, I don't think. We never know. After this, Scott and Ramona exit through a subspace door. This is where Scott and Ramona start their relationship over again. As we roll the credits. With epic music, of course. The music in this movie is in the better half of movies I've seen, in my opinion. Music, of course, is subjective, like any piece of art, but this one gives off an early 2010s rock feel. Nothing poppy. It feels like this probably because that was the time period it was released in. And also because of a bunch of punk rock songs like Black Sheep being featured in the movie. On the album, there were two versions of this, technically. The first version of this is the original metric version, but the other one is the Brie Larson cover, which we actually hear in the movie. A song like that we also get to see live, technically, and the vocals were probably recorded beforehand or whatever, but that's something else. Anyways, we get to see the band Sex Bomb, which continues the feel of punk rock from the early 2010s with their sound. Honestly, it is pretty nice since the people in the band actually practiced to perform in this movie. Maybe it will become the next Green Day if they continue playing. The other thing that needs to be discussed with the tracks is the sound of the movie. The movie has a unique sound font for a movie, where there's a lot of video game sounds and nothing that's been like Marvelized. There's probably some popular sounds throughout the movie, but there's more stuff to remind you of retro video games and stuff like that. It is a unique, fresher light with sounds, since everything isn't risers or something generic, since Edgar Wright actually wanted to stay loyal to the source material. Overall, it is something that is rare and experimental, so it adds to the movie experience overall. There's a lot of trivia to this movie, honestly. If you're a movie geek, you can look into it further on the Scott Pilgrim fan wiki or something else like that. One of the interesting facts is that throughout the movie, they barely blink. This is because Edgar Wright thought it would add a comic book feeling to it, which resulted in the cast only blinking 3 times throughout the film. The other cool facts about this movie have to do with the alternate endings that almost happened. One of them is that Knives and Scott got back together, but thankfully this one was scrapped. It's scrapped due to character development reasons, but I have to give a shout out to Brian Lee O'Malley for canceling the idea and not having it take over the true ending. The other ending, which was presented by Edgar Wright, was dubbed the Coin Killer ending. This would turn the movie into if you change the city from Toronto to Chicago, because Scott turns into the Coin Killer. It's more like a Facebook theory than anything, because it states that Scott actually killed these exes, he didn't defeat them, and he just put coins there. Honestly, possibly knowing Scott, like whole drug trip during this movie, because that's kind of what it is. He would then, he'd put coins all around the victims and make it like seem like a crime, and that's why it got the name of that ending. Luckily, this could have been cool, but maybe we'll see this when the like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World enters the public domain in I don't know how many years. Otherwise, these endings aren't as good as the original, but it's really hard to compare to that because that's the best one out of these options. Scott Pilgrim is a movie that sadly didn't receive enough attention in the theaters. It came out on August 13th, 2010, which is a Friday the 13th, by the way. With Edgar Wright films, it is really hard to grasp a pattern, so with current knowledge, I do not know if it follows a summer release date trend or whatnot, because it doesn't add up with other movies around this time period. But like Fight Club, it was a box office failure technically. It only made 51.7 million USD against a 65 to 80 million USD budget. This movie didn't make a profit in the box office, but luckily was able to get a fandom outside of the theater, and because of the comics probably. And it's always good to see a movie do that and get recognition. As of recording the movie, it has a 7.6 out of 10 on IMDb. Not in the top 250 movies, sadly. The scores on Letterboxd currently is a 3.9 out of 5, which doesn't put it in the top 250 there. And it would actually be a 7.8 out of 10 if you use the correct way of measuring movies and you're not like a heathen. And the other notable places of reviews are Rotten Tomatoes with an 83% and a Metacritic score of 69%. So overall, it received highly on those websites, and it's higher than average at least. Overall, Scott Pilgrim is a very interesting movie if you like the video game aesthetic of it. If you don't, well, it's a hit or miss whether you like it or not. I would say, if that's your opinion on it, watch it with a friend or something. If you do like the aesthetic of it, then I would say watch it, since it's enjoyable to see all those Easter eggs and hear all those sounds. It's not my favorite Edgar Wright movie, but it's one of my favorites from him that I've seen. Overall, I would give the movie a 9 out of 10, but again, it is all up to the people's opinions as they watch the movie, so always check out the movie to see what you think, because opinions do matter, or something like democracy. Like and subscribe, pretty please.